On Geonosis, it took Count Dooku just 31 seconds to finish Obi-Wan Kenobi. 2 wounds, 1 lightsaber sent skidding across the arena floor. The Dark Lord, a former Jedi Master turned to the corrupting path, barely moved his feet. When it was over, he spoke his parting words the way someone might note the time. The Jedi he had just defeated was not worth thinking about further. For years afterward, Dooku carried that judgment with him as a simple, settled fact. But the Jedi he dismissed would one day be named alongside the Order's most dangerous warriors. A covert operative program would prepare for him by name, and he would walk away from Mustafar with the galaxy's deadliest student burning on the shore behind him. How a dismissed Jedi became the one fighter the Shadow Order had no plan for starts with a master who taught through silence. Before he became one of the most studied fighters in the Jedi Order, Kenobi was an impatient apprentice. The canon novel Master and Apprentice captures his frustration directly. Most Padawans, the apprentices of Jedi Knights, expected to move through the basics quickly and find something personal. Qui-Gon Jinn did the opposite. The older Jedi kept his student drilling basic moves long after the technique was clean, and he offered no reason why. That silence was the lesson. Qui-Gon was not just teaching technique, he was building a floor so steady that a man could stand on it when grief, exhaustion, or terror stripped everything else away. The young apprentice could not see it yet. He could react, he could move with the Force. However, he could not yet be still enough to let the Force move through him. The gap between them would take years to close. Near the end of their years together, Qui-Gon finally gave the explanation he had withheld. He said that even full knights forgot the most basic technique was also the most important. He wanted his student grounded so completely that those moves became pure instinct. Everything the younger Jedi built later would rest on that base. Kenobi received that explanation just before losing the man who gave it. The form Qui-Gon practiced was called Ataru, known as Form 4. According to the Legends source, The Jedi Path, a training manual for Jedi students, Ataru was built for one purpose: to end a fight before the opponent had time to recover. The form used spins, forward rolls, and side flips. It demanded space, air, and an opponent who could be overwhelmed fast. It also carried a warning most young practitioners ignored. The form was exhausting. A fighter who could not break through quickly had no good option but to pull back. Crucially, Ataru had no answer for what to do when a quick win did not come. That blind spot was about to cost Qui-Gon Jinn his life. Before the duel on Naboo, Darth Maul did something most shadowed operatives would never bother to do. He prepared. The Legends novelization of The Phantom Menace is the only source that preserves this detail, and it changes how the entire fight reads. Maul physically walked through every section of the plasma refinery before the Jedi arrived. He timed the cycling laser gates until he understood their rhythm. He mapped the catwalks, measured distances between platforms, and moved between levels until the layout was fixed in his body. He dropped a tool into the reactor shaft to test its depth. He already knew, before either Jedi set foot inside, exactly where one of them would fall. The narrow catwalks would strip away Ataru's need for space. The vertical drop would remove the option of retreat. The Dark Lord had seen the older Jedi pull back once before on Tatooine, when his energy dropped and the fight tipped. In the refinery, there was nowhere to pull back to. Kenobi watched his master during the waiting periods between the cycling gates. Qui-Gon meditated, pulling fresh energy from the Force and attacking with new power. However, the reserve burned through quickly. His strikes lost their edge. The operative across from him, reading the drop, simply retook the offensive. Kenobi was not just watching his master lose, he was watching Ataru claim the life of the man who had mastered it. When Qui-Gon fell, grief took over. The Legends book Jedi vs. Sith: The Essential Guide to the Force records that Kenobi absolutely wanted to defeat the Dark Lord, and Maul used that consuming need against him. The apprentice was disarmed and knocked into the reactor shaft. It was hanging over that drop that Kenobi found the first real stillness of his life. He let the grief go. He stopped trying to force the outcome and let the Force respond. The weapon built for Ataru became an instrument guided by something else entirely. In the written account he left afterward, the warning was direct. Do not lose yourself to strong emotion, even briefly. It works against the Jedi Code and makes the enemy stronger. He had found the mechanism. 2 more lessons were coming, and after them, there would be no returning to Ataru. Geonosis was the first of those lessons. The Legends novelization of Attack of the Clones frames the fight with Dooku precisely. The Count was not a sword fighter in the Order's usual sense. He was a fencer practicing an older style called Makashi, or Form 2, built specifically for blade-on-blade combat. The Jedi Order had largely abandoned it, but Dooku had kept it for decades. What the fallen Jedi saw across the arena floor was not a stranger. He saw his former apprentice's student, carrying inherited patterns he already knew how to take apart. The novelization describes Kenobi's movements as overextended and wasteful. By contrast, Dooku moved along a line. His feet balanced. 3 clean sequences finished it. A fake low thrust pulled the blade down, a sharp pullback and high stab struck the left shoulder, and a follow-through cut the right thigh. A last motion sent the weapon sliding across the floor. The same form had cost Qui-Gon his life on Naboo. Now, it had cost his apprentice the fight on Geonosis. 31 seconds, 2 wounds. The same pattern was written across both defeats. And it was about to be written a 3rd time, in a way far worse. Yoda, the ancient Grand Master of the Jedi Order, had sent 200 Jedi to Geonosis. By the time the clone forces arrived, just over 20 were still standing. 200 down to 20. Most of them did not fall to individual duels. They fell under mass blaster fire, cut down from angles they could not reach, by numbers they could not outfight. These surviving Jedi pulled back to the center of the arena, and what kept them alive was not their personal dueling style. It was one basic ability: block range fire, stay upright. The form built for exactly that situation had been sitting in the archives for years, quietly set aside by the Order itself. The Jedi senior instructors had decided across generations that the defensive form called Soresu was too inward, too narrow. It offered no path to a clear win. Dueling styles that produced impressive results in the training halls got attention. Soresu did not. What those instructors had not prepared for was the scene on Geonosis. 200 Jedi, carrying the full range of the Order's individual mastery, could be cut down by range fire because none of them had been built to withstand it at that scale. The cost of that decision had just been counted in lives. Soresu, Form 3, was called the Resilience Form. According to Jedi vs. Sith, the essential guide to the Force, it had not started as a dueling style. It began as an answer to a practical problem. Blaster weapons had spread across the galaxy, and Jedi skills were no longer enough against heavy range fire. The original purpose was narrow: redirect laser bolts. Over centuries, that simple purpose grew into something much deeper. The Jedi Path describes Soresu as the ultimate expression of defense. Against other blade fighters, the practitioner pulled every motion close to the body, with no wide sweeps or forward lunges, just a strong defensive shell. Against range fire, the fighter entered what the manual called moving meditation, a focused state that let them sense every shooter's position and move the blade to block every shot. The manual called this the circle of shelter. However, the same manual said something uncomfortable. A Form 3 master cannot strike back. That line unsettled the Order. Senior Masters built an entire alternative form, Form 5, in response, believing Soresu was too passive and too slow to win. Form 5's guiding idea was simple: peace through superior firepower. Kenobi did not take that answer. What he chose instead was already written in the Soresu manual itself. The form did not ask how to win, it asked how to make it impossible to lose. And the man who fully believed the second question was the only man who could turn the form into a weapon. An ancient Jedi named Rekpa had once written that a duel should not be seen as a choice between winning and losing. Every duel could have many outcomes. When a fighter focused only on winning, the fighter damaged the victory. Soresu was the only form in the Order built around that idea. Kenobi was the only Jedi who had been broken down far enough to fully believe it. The form also asked for something that could not be directly taught. Most practitioners never accessed it. Those wishing to study Soresu were told to meditate first, because the form was the most inward of all forms. The practitioner had to become a calm center while opponents pushed and struck around them. That stillness was not emptiness, it was awareness, listening to the Force in real time. That stillness was the form's deepest principle. Most practitioners never reached it. The Legends novel Shatterpoint contains the private journal of Mace Windu, a senior member of the Jedi Council. Windu wrote that the Jedi did not figure things out, they did not make deliberate plans. Such actions were the opposite of what being a Jedi meant. They let the Force flow through them and followed its currents towards the right outcome. Most of Jedi training, he wrote, came down to one thing: learning to trust instinct over analysis, to become a channel for the Force rather than its operator. Every word of that passage described how Kenobi's Soresu worked at its peak. He allowed the block to happen rather than choosing it. Meanwhile, Windu himself had built the exact style Kenobi's Soresu stood against. In the same journal, Windu's signature form Vapad, a variation of Form 7, is described not as a technique, but as a way of thinking. It required embracing the intensity of battle, channeling the practitioner's own pull toward the corrupting path back outward as offensive power. Extended use produced what the senior master called blood fever, a growing hunger for combat he recognized as the first stage of something darker. On the planet Harun Kal, far from the steady influence of the Jedi Temple, he had caught himself wanting to defeat enemies, not to protect anyone. Just for the satisfaction of it, and that recognition sat under everything he said to Kenobi before Utapau. Because Windu had made another mistake once, one far larger than blood fever. On Geonosis, during the first confrontation with Dooku, the senior council member had seen the Count's weakness clearly. He had understood that ending the fallen Jedi in that moment would collapse the Separatist movement before it could fully form. The Separatists were the political faction breaking away from the Republic. Ending Dooku then would have ended the war before it started. However, he held back. Respect for a former colleague. Reluctance to strike down someone he had once known. The hesitation lasted only a moment, but the Clone Wars, a 3-year galactic conflict that claimed millions of lives, began in that space between recognition and hesitation. Windu had spent the years since watching the consequences of that one moment. He had seen the toll rise from a choice his own aggressive instincts should have prevented. He, more than anyone, understood the cost of letting aggression hesitate at the wrong moment. And he understood, just as clearly, the cost of letting aggression take over. So when he pulled Kenobi aside before the Utapau campaign, the advice that came out was not just instruction, it was a confession. The Legends novelization of Revenge of the Sith records the conversation. Kenobi told the senior master that Soresu felt almost passive, defensive, and incomplete. Windu cut through that framing immediately. Every other form in the Order had been built to cover a specific weakness. He had created Vapad to manage his own pull towards the corrupting influence. Yoda had developed Ataru to make up for the limits of his size and age. Count Dooku had kept Makashi because it suited his preference for precision over power. Soresu answered no weakness in Kenobi because there was no weakness left to cover. That was not a compliment, it was a diagnosis. Windu was not calling him the most powerful swordsman in the Order. He was pointing at the difference between a great fighter who invented a personal form to solve a personal problem and a master who had made the classic form complete. Be who you are, Windu said, and General Grievous will never defeat you. The same novelization lays out the distinction cleanly. Against the galaxy's greatest living fighters, Anakin carried bold confidence and physical flair. Windu and his former apprentice Depa Billaba carried a ferocity that cast shadows around them. Shakti and Dooku moved with stylish precision. Yoda was a control force of motion. Kenobi had none of those qualities. He was simplicity itself. The absence of flair, ferocity, and style was not a gap, it was the whole mechanism. On Canon and Legends, fungal spores filled the air and Kenobi lost his breathing gear. Battle droids kept entering through cycling doors. He held a position under steady fire for a long stretch, barely upright, swaying, eyes glassy. The Legends novel Labyrinth of Evil describes him as weary but alert, unsteady but sure-footed. He felt, at moments, as if he were simply holding the lightsaber and letting it move on its own. When Anakin Skywalker arrived afterward and asked what form his partner had been using, the older Jedi could not remember the engagement at all. Anakin told him it looked more like the absence of a form. Kenobi answered in 4 words, "The beauty of Form 3. The fight with Grievous showed it in real time." The cyborg general attacked with 4 arms and 12 strikes per second, each from a different angle. Not one touched the older Jedi. When Grievous pushed the pace to 20 strikes per second and began finding openings, Kenobi answered with a single small shift on one block. He redirected the incoming blade towards a hand grip instead of towards another saber. A thumb fell, and one blade fell with it. The defense had become the offense with a single precise cut and one weapon gone. Stunt coordinator Nick Gillard once described the prequel-era fight design with a phrase that maps exactly onto how Soresu worked. He called it a game of chess played at 1,000 miles an hour, where every single move was checked. In chess, a checked position means every response the opponent makes creates a new problem. That was exactly what the form did in sustained combat. Every block forced the attacker into worse ground than before. No move improved the aggressor's position. The longer they pushed, the more they lost. By the time their paths crossed again, Count Dooku had noticed the change. In the same Labyrinth of Evil, the fallen Jedi stops a combat drill with Grievous midway and delivers a lesson. A player who had memorized every classic opening and standard response could still lose to someone who knew nothing about traditional patterns. Being locked into set responses left a fighter open to the unexpected. Then, Dooku named the Jedi Grievous had to prepare for by name: Sin Dralik, Mace Windu, Yoda, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. That is the full distance the dismissed Jedi had traveled. The same novel reveals what Darth Sidious, the hidden Dark Lord behind the war, had arranged for the Invisible Hand engagement, the flagship of the Separatist fleet. Sidious ordered Dooku to eliminate Kenobi directly. The reason was specific. Kenobi's fall would push Anakin deeper into grief and dread. It would break the younger knight apart in ways nothing else could. Kenobi was the central piece of a plan built to turn Anakin to the corrupting path. The Dark Master had prepared a contingency for Anakin to defeat Dooku. He had a plan for both outcomes of that duel. However, no contingency existed for Kenobi simply surviving. Dooku arrived on the Invisible Hand with his own plan fully formed. It failed before he could register it. The novel describes the confrontation from inside the Count's head. His plan was to drive thrusts at Kenobi's legs to force the old Ataru overhead flip, then strike through as the Jedi landed. The plan was so clearly mapped that he almost missed what was actually happening. Kenobi was not jumping. The older Jedi was not moving his feet at all. The man he had dismissed on Geonosis was gone. What stood across from him had no pattern left to read, and he had nothing prepared for that. The same book reflects on the earlier Geonosis fight from Dooku's view. Both Jedi had fought the Jedi way, releasing desire and letting the Force flow through them. Against the Count's command of the corrupting techniques, that approach had no answer. The gap between 31 seconds on Geonosis and complete failure on the Invisible Hand was not about speed, it was not about strength. It was about which direction the Force was flowing. And that was the gap no Dark Lord had been trained to close. Mustafar was where Soresu met the one opponent it had never faced. Someone who had trained alongside it for years. Someone who knew every instinct it had built. The Legends novelization of Revenge of the Sith sets the terms clearly. Blade to blade, Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker were equal. After thousands of hours of training together, they knew each other better than brothers. The duel could not be decided by technique alone. Anakin knew Soresu from the inside. He had drilled against it for years, absorbed its rhythms, and understood how the form shed force rather than resisted it. In pure analysis, he had the knowledge to break it. The form could be broken. However, it could only be broken by a fighter who could redirect his own intensity at the moment of maximum pressure, pull back when the drive to push was at its highest, and wait with real patience until the opening appeared. Anakin Skywalker, standing on Mustafar with grief and consuming emotion having taken over everything else, could not do any of those things. Applying his knowledge would have required him to act like someone he had already stopped being. The wrath closed off every path that led to patience. The map he carried in his head was a map of a place he could not enter. So the shell held. His momentum was not being stopped. It was being guided steadily towards the place where he would defeat himself. When the duel reached its highest point, and Anakin forced both sabers down in what should have been the finishing blow, the novel describes what happened without technical detail. Kenobi let go of everything at once: his hopes, his grief, and his failure with his former apprentice. The release created the opening, not a countermove, not the terrain, just complete surrender at the moment of maximum pressure, exactly what the form's deepest principle demanded. In the Legends account preserved in the life and legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the older master wrote it simply. In the end, Skywalker was more determined to defeat him than to defend himself, blinded by his own emotion when he fell. Kenobi had not beaten him, Anakin had beaten himself. The fighter using Soresu was simply not where the strike could land, and the younger man's own force carried him the rest of the way. And it was the form no Sith Master had built a counter for. Mace Windu had called Kenobi the Master of Soresu, not a master, the Master, the one practitioner who had taken the form to its absolute limit and found nothing beyond it to reach for. Every other form in the Order had patched a gap in its practitioner, and every gap was a way in. What Windu had named as a diagnosis meant something larger for everyone who would face Kenobi. No personal angle to attack, no characteristic flaw to bait, and no distinguishing weakness to read. He had taken Qui-Gon's years of silent drilling. He had combined it with the Force-guided stillness first found over a reactor shaft on Naboo, and he had built something the galaxy had no category for. A form that could not be rushed, that could not be studied, that could not be broken, because the man using it had already let go of everything an opponent could use against him. This is why the Dark Master had no contingency for him. It was not a tactical oversight, it was philosophical. The entire framework of the corrupting path ran on desire, the drive to direct the Force rather than be directed by it, the drive to shape outcomes towards a chosen end, the drive to win on purpose. Every plan the hidden ruler ever built was built inside that framework, and that framework had no way to account for a fighter who would remove desire from the equation entirely. A man who did not need to win, a man who would release winning as a thing to pursue. He cannot be baited. He cannot be worn down. He cannot be outmaneuvered through his own ambitions, because he no longer had any. The gap in the Dark Lord's plans was not a missing scenario, it was a missing category. The deadliest style in the galaxy belonged to the Jedi everyone had already dismissed, and the Dark Master who had planned for everything else had no answer for a man who had stopped wanting anything at all. But this isn't where his story ends. The man who became the Jedi Order's greatest survivor still had years ahead of him. Watch Obi-Wan's full story next.